Hello, good evening. Welcome to A Tortoise ThinkIn on, what day is it? Tuesday. I'm back from a few weeks off. It's lovely to be here. For those of you that are expecting me to be James Harding, he will be joining us. We do at Tortoise call him last minute Harding. I don't think he knows that, but he will be joining us. But I'm going to kick the proceedings off as he is waylaid en route to the meeting today. We are thrilled to have with us Cass Sunstein, who is a hugely influential behavioural scientist, currently the Robert Walmsley University Professional at Harvard, and winner of the Holberg Prize in 2018, which I understand is often talked about as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and the Humanities, co-author of a book called Nudge, which I'm sure that many people on the ThinkIn this evening will have read, albeit perhaps some time ago, which was a hugely influential piece of work in the field of behavioural science. The type of science that I feel as though I have heard a lot more about in the last 3 months since we've all been in lockdown, on the government briefings in particular, than I had at any time before, as a consumer of news, certainly. And I'm looking forward to talking to him about the role of behavioural science in managing pandemics and managing human behaviour in general, or understanding perhaps rather than managing. And also, Cass has written a book, a weirdly prophetic book recently called How Change Happens, which talks about how social movements begin and move, and I'd love to talk to him about that. It's in relation to what we've seen in Black Lives Matter and the protests going on around the world. So I'll say good evening to most people on the call, but for Cass is in Boston, so it's good lunchtime to Cass. Thank you very much for being here. Let's start with a real basic entry-level question. Cass, briefly, behavioural science, because we've all in the UK been following the science for the last 3 months apparently. What is it?
Basic idea is that we should do social policy by consulting what evidence we have about how human beings actually behave. So it's in a way a reaction to economic theory, which assumes perfect rationality, and we know that people suffer or maybe benefit from unrealistic optimism. That's part of the human species. Most people think they are less likely to get in an accident than the average person, and maybe everyone thinks their sense of humor is better than the average person. People suffer or benefit from inertia. We tend to focus on today and tomorrow and not so much the long term. That's called present bias. So if you put unrealistic optimism together with an inertia and present bias, you'll have some clues about why some serious public health risks don't get addressed, and also some clues about why it's challenging to get people to move, and also about what strategies might actually work to move people in healthier directions, say.
So a question I wanted to ask, and I'm thrilled to get the chance to ask you, because I could have asked, friends on a Zoom call or something over a glass of wine and got a much less good answer, is, and this is partly my not understanding how the science of behavioural science works, how it's developed, how we know. When the UK government told us on March the 23rd to stay at home, that there was a lot of talk about the timing of that instruction, that had they told us to lock down sooner than that, we wouldn't have observed it because we didn't understand, and if they'd gone later. And what I have wondered as an ordinary citizen, punter, recipient of this instruction is, how can a scientific theory ever predict how people will behave in a situation which was, I feel myself about to say the word unprecedented, which I was trying to avoid, but there were so many variables, we'd never seen it before. How could they have been so sure that that was the right moment in the context? How does the science tell you that? Because you can't test it in a lab, right?
Yes, so I'd be surprised if they were so sure. They might have been, but that's not how political life usually is. Let me say a little about behavioral science and where we actually know some things. So we know if people are asked whether they want to enroll in something, like to be an organ donor, something relevant in the UK now, the participation rate is going to be a lot lower than if people are automatically enrolled and asked whether they want to opt out. We have a lot of data on that. We know on average the participation rate is at least 25% higher under opt-out than opt-in. So
Right.
we know that that drives up rates. We know a communication that's simple and clear typically has a more impactful consequence than one that is complicated and hard. For people, that's intuitive, but we can actually discipline that. To know exactly the date when a lockdown should be mandated or suggested, that's extremely challenging. If you have some data, survey data on how much people hate the idea of a lockdown, you can get clarity about how ineffective it might be at a certain date. And so in government, it's to be hoped that there's in real time information being obtained about how people feel about things. And that may be what the UK government actually had.
Yeah, interesting. I'd love to know. There's a question in the chat which is fascinating, which I'm going to put to you now, Cass, from a member, Robert Wavell, about climate change. It relates to your point about simplicity and simplicity of instruction in order to affect change. And then after that, my colleague James has arrived, and so I think he'll probably take over after that. But let's go to Robert if we can first. Robert, are you there? Robert Wavell? Hello, Robert. See if we can find you. Robert's question, I can say it for him, is about behavioural change and climate change. If he could do one thing to help mainstream behaviour change to speed up the climate transition, what would that be?
Well, if it's going to be choice preserving, it would be automatically enroll people in clean energy and ask them whether they want to opt out. That is behavioral, and it allows people to have freedom of choice. It's being done all over the world, and we have new data from Germany suggesting that actually people are being automatically enrolled in clean energy, and it's having a huge impact in shifting people to things that are better for the climate. If we want to do one thing in terms of policy, it's pretty clear. You'd have a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, and it would be, not a low tax. It would start maybe in the vicinity, and I'm just throwing out a number here, of 10 to 20 euros per ton, and it would get higher over time. Now, of course, there are a lot of things to balance in thinking about the magnitude of the tax. In Germany, Chancellor's been very astute, I think, in just instituting a tax. It's relatively low, but to have that tax is a start to a path toward reduced emissions.
Okay, fab. I'm going to hand over to James. He's itching to put his questions to you. James, are you there?
I am here.
Hurrah, welcome.
I'm here. Liz, you've known me long enough to know I've had a lifelong battle with punctuality. I'm losing.
We're going to deploy some weapons-grade behavioural science against you, James.
Can I say to the audience that this is all staged, and we're demonstrating bounded rationality and unrealistic optimism, and the punctuality. He was here 15 minutes ago. The demonstration worked.
I wish that was true.
Could I say, ever since I was at school, I needed someone like you, Cass, to come in to my aid and give me a decent excuse when I had none. Forgive me and apologies to everyone who's here. And Liz, please keep weighing in. Let's discuss with Professor Sunstein in every angle. I'm really glad we've started on the subject of behavioural science, because the truth is, Cass, is that it has taken a huge knock in the UK. The confidence that people have in the way in which government and people in authority read public behaviour has been hugely undermined. And I don't know whether or not that's a similar factor in the US, but do you think that what's happened is that since your book and since the spread of nudge units around the world, we put too much faith in behavioural science, and actually we didn't have the humility to recognise how little we know about how groups of people react to big events?
I'd say just the opposite, that if anything, countries all over the world have put too little faith in behavioral science and are reacting on the basis of intuitions or guesses rather than what's out there. So the success stories from New Zealand and Australia and Canada and the United States are plentiful in terms of use of behavioral sciences. There should be much more, whether we're talking about poverty or highway safety, where Sweden has a Vision Zero program that's been terrifically successful that uses behavioral science. So lives saved are very high through uses of behavioral science. It's true that like any science, physics, biology, neuroscience, we're constantly learning. And it may be that people who are specialists in behavioral science just are wrong on something. And it's certainly possible that public servants are wrong. But we wouldn't give up, I think, on chemistry, because it turned out that some findings or hopes or speculations turned out not to be true. We just try to do better chemistry, and that's true of behavioral science as well.
And what about when you move to a stage, as we're now in, of greater complexity? Because I think one of the things that people are now discussing, and I noticed actually someone in the chat made this point about how you make a balanced judgment on economic impact and the consequences of a recession, possibly even a long and very deep one, versus the health risks. How does a behavioral scientist think about those two competing interests, and if it's possible to make a cost-benefit analysis of weighing the one versus the other?
Okay, so let's say that we have knowledge that wearing masks is helpful, or we have knowledge that people should, in some country, be staying home more than they otherwise would. Behavioral science will give us some information about how to make those things happen. And many countries have been using what we know successfully in order to make those things happen. The question whether people should be staying at home in circumstances, and let's stipulate where staying at home is good for health, but not good for economic everything. And that means it's going to have especially hard effects on poor people. Then what should we do? Behavioral economics is about behavior, not about social welfare. So we need an account of social welfare, and I apologize for an abstraction. So let's get concrete. We want to know the human consequences of various possible interventions, and their economics and philosophy are two ways of thinking about it. That great Englishman, Jeremy Bentham, had an approach, which is, I think, a very good entree, which is we think of what are the best human consequences on balance. And if there's a health intervention that will save one life in the next year and have a extremely damaging economic impact, probably shouldn't do it. If there's a health intervention that's going to save, let's say, 5 million people in the next year and have a modest economic impact, let's stipulate not good, then we should still do it. We'd have to fill in the meaning of the word modest. And if you're with me so far, then we're really in business. I was in the US government on exactly these issues. And to try to do, let's call it humanized cost-benefit analysis, that is to be as quantitative as we possibly can be, with a sense of, the fact that a human life isn't reducible to a dollar equivalent, but then we're really able to talk about something. And the various phases of opening, which we're observing in multiple places, New Zealand is one that's really opening pretty big, I understand now, are based on a pretty disciplined understanding of what do you get and what do you lose from opening a little bit or a lot. And once we get very numerical about what we gain or what we lose, then we're doing something that isn't like science, like chemistry, but it's a lot closer to science than saying just how we feel.
And Cass, help me out here, because one of the things that I think that's difficult, just sticking with this question of the economics versus health, is that you obviously have in-year outcomes on health that you can measure. And even if you're measuring excess deaths, right, so not just COVID-19 related deaths, you've got something concrete that you can measure in year. The consequences of a recession can be lifelong. They certainly don't play out in the year that you're measuring. And is there any, therefore, meaningful way that you can compare one with the other? And isn't it almost inevitable that you underestimate the impacts of what's happening economically and socially?
I don't think so. So what would you rather have, 100 euros today or 1,000 euros in a year? And unless you have a really, really high discount rate, it's called, probably you'd rather have, or unless you're really sick, probably rather have €1,000 in a year. So discount rates are the way we make commensurable long-term gains and costs versus short-term gains and costs. And it's really standard to do this. So a lot of the people who are concerned about climate change, which I'm really grateful you raised, acknowledge there's got to be a discount rate where a future harm is not equivalent to a current harm, at least not in monetary terms. And then there are tools to figure out what the right discount rate is. And while people disagree about that, the disagreements are not crazy, wild disagreements. They're kind of within the family disagreements. With climate change and with long-term economic harm, it's possible that a political actor will grossly undervalue future distress or illness or whatever, but that would be a failure of the political actor. And at least many governments have safeguards in place to reduce the risk of that failure, meaning you have to take on board all costs and benefits, not just those in 2020.
So Cass, I want to bring in Jack Campbell, if I may, not least because he's asked a question which I'm not sure I entirely understand, so it's probably better that he puts the point to you. But I do want to open up a little and ask too about information and the information economy as we continue this conversation. But Jack, why don't you have a go? Because I think the question you put was, can we reconcile fairness with Purrito efficiency in a market economy? And you're going to have to explain that to me before you discuss it with Cass.
Yeah, well, I'm not entirely sure I understand it myself. I am a short-suffering economist, as opposed to Cass, who I'm sure has been in it for a very long time. But essentially, I'm wondering, Purrito efficiency is the idea that you could have someone with $100 and someone with $0, and whilst it's not fair, that initial allocation of wealth, under Purrito efficiency, you can't give someone else money without making the other person worse off. Purrito efficiency is essentially saying that there has to be a mutually beneficial outcome to any trade. So is there a way to sort of reconcile fairness with Purrito efficiency, maybe using some idea nudge theory? Can that be done? Or is that just sort of pie in the sky?
So a change is a Pareto superior move if it makes at least one person better off without making anyone worse off.
Okay.
So let's suppose we have two people, one has $50 and another has $100. If a space alien gives $1 to either, that's a Pareto superior move. And there's no palpable unfairness with making either better off. There might be a background unfairness with the inequality where one person has a lot less than another. So think of Pareto superior moves, I think, as things that are just ambiguously better than what preceded them. So you and I are talking, Jack, and if you suddenly got from the sky €100 and I got nothing, that would be Pareto superior. I'm just where I was and you're better off. And it'd be hard to figure out why that would be unfair unless it would aggravate some pre-existing inequality. But then the problem is the pre-existing inequality. So I think a simpler way to put it is that there are two problems. One is unfair inequality, and we need to have less of that. And another is Pareto superior moves, and we need to have more of that. They're both good. And they're not in any tension, not in any evident tension with each other.
And what do you think, Cass? I'm going to piggyback on Jack's intelligent point with something much more clumsy, which is a sense that I've got around inequality itself, that it seems too ingrained. In fact, what you're seeing in the United States, and the sort of stubbornness of injustice and racism, surely makes you think that some of the things that we've favored in terms of nudge theory or behavioral science that prod different behaviors are just insufficient to the problems we've got, and that we need much more, powerful interventions to change the landscape. What do you say to that?
Well, I basically agree with that, but let me kind of try to break it up a little bit.
Yes.
So there's a program in my country that gives poor children free school meals. So your family doesn't have any money, you get lunch and breakfast for free. It's an equality promoting program, and it's a distress reducing program. It's an anti-poverty program.
Mhm.
But a lot of the parents don't sign up. It might be because they're busy. It might be because they're scared. It might be because they don't really understand what they're supposed to do. And so the nudge was automatically to enroll those children in those programs. They don't have to sign up anymore. And at last count, 15 million, I want to pause over that, 15 million kids are enrolled in the program as a result of the nudge. And that's a statistic, but let's line up some small percentage of those children and put them on a street in London. And it's going to be hard, I think, not to weep, because this is really changing people's lives. There are many programs that can be made much better through smart nudges, including anti-poverty and education programs and employment programs. And the track record is that we have a bunch of those nudges in place in at least some countries, and they're really working. Having said that, I agree with you that whether the problem is economic inequality or racial injustice, nudges are only part of the picture. So to have a progressive income tax that is aggressively redistributing resources to people who are really struggling is a very good idea. And to have a reformation of criminal justice systems so that people of color aren't subject to systematic maltreatment, that's a really good idea. Now, some of that change has to involve nudges, where police officers will be prohibited, let's say, from engaging in certain misconduct, but a prohibition might not be worth the paper it's written on. There needs to be nudges also. And one very effective nudge is social norms, where we all are acting in accordance with social norms all the time, not because we're going to go to jail if we violate them, even if they do map onto criminal prohibitions, but either because we're scared of other people thinking you're a creep, or because our own conscience says the norm is one we should obey.
So go on. Okay,
so that any component, problems are really large. And to say, what are we going to do about equality is a recipe for, I think, paralysis. To say this step, whether it's a progressive income tax or the earned income tax credit, which helps the working poor, or a nudge that helps people benefit from programs from which the take-up rate is, let's say, 30%, and that's a human tragedy. Let's do all three of those.
And what do you say? I know we got you here, Cass, in theory to talk about COVID-19 and behavioural science and nudges, but it seems mad not to talk about the murder of George Floyd and the response to it. Specifically, what would you do? What do you do in the behavioural science, in the nudge part of the forest, but what do you do in terms of legal interventions? We've in our newsroom been talking about, is it time to have a proper debate about reparations? Is it time to have a different view on prison systems and incarceration? What would you do that's beyond behavioural science and nudges, that's a more concrete intervention? How do you think about making change? Because the problem is obviously a stubborn one.
Okay, so I worked a long time ago for Thurgood Marshall, who
Yes.
Probably the greatest civil rights lawyer in American history. He was my boss. And I remember one afternoon where we were talking about whether the court on which he sat, he was Supreme Court Justice, whether the court might overrule Miranda, which is the case about Miranda warnings. And it's a way of preventing certain kinds of police abuses. And we were all white law clerks to him, and we were worried about overruling Miranda. And he looked at us and he said, Miranda, I like Miranda. It's good. But let me tell you a tale. When I was in New York, there was a lot of police abuse. And the precinct captain and I sat down and we had a nice long talk. And he said that with mischief, and the famous lawyer at the time. And I talked to the precinct captain. And the next day, the precinct captain got all of the police officers in a room and said to them, if I hear about any of you violating the constitutional rights of citizens, if I hear any of you doing something to African Americans because of the color of their skin, that day you are going to be fired. Immediately, you are going to be fired. And then Marshall looked at the four of us and he actually thundered. His voice said, that's better than Miranda. And what he was saying is you need local accountability. That was a nudge and more than a nudge,
Yes.
but local accountability in which the person in charge says, we're not going to allow that to happen. And that's the insight from which I would build a response, a particular response.
But then I put to you, Cass, the problem would be with that answer is that you need many more Thurgood Marshalls, not just, I mean, in personality and force of personality, but in positions of power. You need them on the Supreme Court. You need to change the structure of American leadership to do that. So there does need to be some kind of intervention.
Yeah, I don't think so. So Marshall's story was actually precisely not about the Supreme Court of the United States. It was about local stuff. Right. So this precinct guy you've never heard of, he's not famous, he's not in the newspaper, just ran a relatively small operation. And he said, this isn't going to happen on my watch.
But is he not persuaded by the fact that Thurgood Marshall is making that case to him?
Well, surely it helped. Surely it helped that Marshall was kind of famous back then. Not that famous back then, and more, I think, just an acquaintance of the guy. So all of us are in one or another respect like the precinct captain. So we can, maybe in some large way, maybe in some small way, do something. And it can be a nudge. It can be not laughing at a racist joke. It can be giving money or volunteering time. And the intractability of the large problem of racism, I think, should be almost a call, like a loud call for a zillion small steps that are like the one that precinct captain took.
Cass, there's something, it's something quite invigorating and rewarding to think that we all have that role as precinct captain. I take that. There are a couple of people who've been making points while we're talking. I want to come to Sanchayan Banerjee in a moment, who's making points about the people who create the nudges, the biases or interests of those groups. But Jonathan Haywood, I see, has got his hand up. So I might come to Jonathan first. Jonathan, hello.
Hi, James. Thank you. Just briefly, I mean, Cass, I've always been a huge fan of your work, both on nudge and on the future of the internet and internet regulation and so on. But in the discussion today, I'm sort of hearing an echo of a discussion that we hear a lot more often on the right, where people are increasingly frustrated by democracy, and a sense that just democracy doesn't deliver, that it stifles government action and so on. And I think, you know, what COVID-19 has done for many of us is to show quite how effective government can be when it is more or less unconstrained by democracy. And there's no, you know, governments, Western liberal governments over the last 2 or 3 months have not been acting primarily by nudge. They've been acting by diktats. They have told us what to do. They have massively reallocated resources. They've restructured the public domain, and they've just got on with it. And there has been, by and large, not so much in the US perhaps, but elsewhere in Europe and the Commonwealth, considerable public support for that kind of, you know, what we can really frankly call anti-democratic government behavior. And I just wonder if you see is that completely anomalous? That's just a response to this unique set of circumstances, or do you think there's an underlying trend there where on both left and right, we're increasingly frustrated by what you might call the imprisoning of government by democracy?
There's a lot there, so thank you for this. First point, those who believe in nudges also agree that there's a place for mandates and bans in the criminal law. So to say that when people buy cars, they should have a sense of the greenhouse gas emissions of the options is not to say we shouldn't have fuel economy standards also. So to say that there should be a prohibition on sexual harassment is not to say we shouldn't also have nudges to lower sexual harassment. And you can't have a system prohibiting discrimination that relies only on nudges, nor could you have one that relies only on prohibitions. You need both. With respect to government, I'm smiling inside really because I worked in the Obama administration, I worked in the White House, and the most important financial legislation in 60 years was passed. That's the Dodd-Frank Act. The most important social legislation was passed. That's the Affordable Care Act. The most aggressive attack on tobacco smoking was passed. The most aggressive attack on greenhouse gases in our country's history occurred. And I'm just not going to bore you with the long list. And these were democratic initiatives, not capital D, not the party, but they were supported by a democratic public in general. So the idea that democracy calls for paralysis is, if anything, only a contingent truth. And often it's just the opposite, where civil rights movements and Thatcherism and Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, these things had significant, at least, democratic backing. I like to think in most countries that the response to COVID-19 is not anti-democratic. That is, it had better not be anti-democratic, at least as a first choice, that it's engaged with and responsive to what the public is wanting. And the countries with which I'm familiar are ones in which there's an interchange between the public and the government. It's not like the public is, in China, yes, the government is saying, here's what's going to happen. But in New Zealand and Australia and Germany and Denmark, these are countries where democracy is crucial to everything that's happened. I hope that's true in the UK as well.
Cass, I'm going to thank you, Jonathan. While you were talking, there are lots of interesting comments in the chat, and so I wanted to bring in a couple of those. Anne-Marie Hall made this interesting point about what the impact is of popularizing elements of economics or political or social sciences. Anne-Marie, I don't know whether you're there, but it seems an interesting point to discuss.
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, hello.
Hi there. Yeah, so I work in comms, and actually for my sins at the moment, I'm working in government comms. And I've worked.
Thank you and good luck.
Yes, not on COVID. There's a lot of people, particularly within kind of government comms, but also within the broader marketing and advertising world and agencies, who are positioning themselves as behaviour change and behavioural science experts, when actually they're enthusiasts. So they've read pretty widely, and it's not done in particular malice in terms of wanting to affect positive social change, but they are playing with things almost that we don't properly understand, and I've probably sat in pitches and been guilty of it myself. But do we think that there's kind of potential negative and unintended consequences that come from sort of this broader sort of amateur practice of delivering the principles from behavioural science, or actually is that just kind of necessary for us to be able to get the discipline kind of mainstreamed and drive that broader change that we're looking to implement?
What a good question. So thank you for that. There's a movement afoot, which I'm just recently been informed of, which is, it's not quite an accreditation group for behavioral science, but it's moving in that direction, where there'd be an effort by people, it might even come from the UK, I think it does, to people who are professionals at this, to distinguish between people who are using the term kind of to legitimate themselves and people who actually know what they're doing. So I do think that's right. It's a little like, isn't it, people call themselves doctors who aren't, or people, my job, I'm a lawyer, people call themselves legal specialists. A lot of people call themselves legal specialists who don't really know much about law. So that's a problem. You're completely right.
Cass, what just on the back of what Anne-Marie asked, there's a question here, which actually comes from an old colleague of mine in the news business, Jason Nisse, which is, how much is behavioural science undermined when the authors of the rules are found to be breaching them? You may have noticed that there's been an argument in our country about the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, being in breach of the lockdown rules. How much does that matter, and how much is it if you like, a lightning rod for frustration? How much does it affect the way in which people actually behave?
Well, it's an empirical question, isn't it? There is a recent empirical paper showing that corruption tends to, at the public level, tends to breed a lot of the same among the population. So that suggests there's a potentially significant problem from breaches. But I think the larger story than breaches, meaning not acting in accordance with behavioral instruction, is that in countries all over the world, and some of this has been really quiet, meaning it hasn't hit the newspapers and people aren't bragging about it, principles of behavioral science are being used effectively to save lives, like a lot of lives. And
for example?
Australia and New Zealand are two, which have had big successes. And if you look at what they've done, there, including all the way to the top, it is behaviorally informed about how to communicate, about how to breed trust, about how to work with social norms, about how to use simplification and to give people the equivalent of a GPS. That's basically a shorthand description of what a nudge does. And these things are working. And that, I think, in the annals of history will be a large lesson of what we've observed the last months, and with all the tragedy and fear, the bright spots are in a way the more enduring lesson.
Well, it's great to hear that. I said I'd bring in Sunstein Banerjee, who was making this point about the biases of people who set the nudges and the interests of those, and there you are. Sunstein, why don't you put that, I don't know whether you've got a specific example in mind or whether you've got something that's systemic in mind.
I think it's sort of more systemic because in this behavioral world, I'm familiar with Professor Sunstein's work and been reading, and I know the sort of critiques that come against it. But in this behavioral world, we know that people are biased, and there's sort of rules of thumbs that these policymakers then use to guide them by changing the choice architecture. But nudges also take away some form of agency from people. And then if the planner gets biased themselves, if they're rent-seeking, how do we then believe that the design of the nudges would always be welfare improving? I mean, isn't that a problem in nudges itself? Would there be a way to rectify it with the designs?
It's a good point. So to say that public officials may be biased or incompetent is completely right. If we were worried about bias or incompetence on the part of public officials and making a list of the things that would concern us, nudges would be at the bottom. Probably prohibitions would be at the top. Civil penalties would be next, maybe. Taxes and fines and subsidies would also be on the list. Something like a reminder or a warning or disclosure of information. Probably we wouldn't say, oh my God. Yes, the terrible things from Mao and Hitler and Stalin were not nudges, though there were terrible nudges. They were stronger stuff. Okay, that's just to say that because these are freedom preserving always, and give people an exit route from their, the direction in which they steer, they allow people to say, I don't like that. I'm going to eat a lot of chocolate, even though you are nudging me not to. Or I actually really like cigarettes, and you're nudging me not to smoke, but to heck with you. That's a freedom preserving thing. With respect to so we can go into theoretically or empirically, and I'll be really short. The empirical record for nudges in the last years, it's excellent. And I'm not sure exactly why it's so excellent, but if you look at what the Australians have done, what's been done in my country, the Trump administration has found that the benefits of the nudges have been really high compared to the costs. What's happened in nations all over Europe, what's happened in Canada, the track record is really good. In terms of theoretical considerations, you need to have something like, I think, a Bill of Rights for nudging, which includes democratic safeguards. So to have an opportunity for public comment and correction is very, very important, and to have the standard rights protections against anything the government does, those should kick in as well. But if you're concerned about government incompetence or bias, please go after mandates and bans first.
Right. Cass, that's so interesting. I want to bring in Joe Whitaker in one moment, but I just want to pick up on that point. That idea of a Bill of Rights for nudges, and I know you've talked about this, about, protections for comment. I just wondered whether you could help us marry, if you like, if we'd had this conversation 15 years ago, we would have talked almost entirely about the first years of the internet and your thinking on that. And to an extent, I'd love to hear you marry what you think about internet, information and free speech with nudges, whether or not you think the problems we're seeing online and the safety of our information and our public square can be addressed by nudges, or whether or not you want something different entirely.
Okay, what a fantastic question. So if you look at Facebook and Twitter, they are doing a lot of nudging. And some of it is economically self-interested. Some of it is to encourage charitable donation on your birthday. Some of it is to draw eyeballs to click on things. Some of it is very favorable to advertisers. Some of it is designed just to nudge you to promote your own interests, which seems kind of a good thing to do, but might not be a good thing to do if it makes people's horizons get narrowed. Mm-hmm. Okay, with respect to whatever ails us, whether it's public health problems or safety or self-governance, the social media companies and the internet generally can do much better. And there are two directions in which they could do better. Let's take the question of falsehood. They could build into their own architecture more aggressive safeguards against damaging falsehoods. Now, Twitter created a controversy because they did only a nudge with respect to a falsehood from the president. I think that was a completely legitimate thing for them to do. Facebook has not done that, and in my view, Facebook should be doing that. So we need much more thinking in the, like tomorrow, about good nudges that protect people first and foremost against health and safety problems that are initiated by uses of social media, and second, and almost first and foremost, about things that will prevent our democracies from being undermined through bad nudges on social media.
But do you think the public square requires more than those nudges? Do you think that we need to have either different interventions in terms of operators online, or do you think we need to have rules of accountability online for those platforms?
Mark Zuckerberg wrote a number of months ago a plea for government regulation of his own company.
Yes.
And whatever motives you attribute to him, I think probably a charitable motive is the most charitable. He's right. And so to have regulatory requirements that are designed to reduce the risk that social media companies are now imposing, I think is a really good idea. Whenever we're dealing with freedom of speech, we should be extremely careful. And John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is, I think, kind of 2020 good reading, because he makes a plea for allowing falsehoods to proliferate. I think he maybe Mr. Mill meet Mr. Facebook and let's have a conversation. Nonetheless, the Millian instinct of freedom is the right one, but it's a little too crude as an opposition to regulation. So things that involve tweaking the architecture, and the word tweak is probably a little too soft, to combat damaging things. That's a really good idea. Facebook has started with its community standards, now public, which do impose pretty strong restrictions on certain kinds of communication. And that maybe the government should mandate that. Maybe the government should mandate compliance with the standards that companies say they follow. That would be a very modest and, maybe very good start.
Interesting. The mandating compliance is much more powerful than it sounds, because it would require those companies then to live by what they say.
Yeah, I think that's a very thinkable small step, which is to say, if Twitter or Facebook or YouTube says, this is what we're going to do, and then they don't, something happens. Maybe they lose some immunity that they currently have. Maybe they have to provide a fee to somebody. Maybe they have to face a court proceeding of some kind. That's very thinkable, and it's really small. I think I'd go further by thinking, what are the best practices that companies now have? And maybe we can mandate them for everybody who's servicing a large enough population, that is.
And forgive me, Cass, I'm just going to stick with this for 1 second, because, you know, prior to COVID, this has been such a dominant subject for people, which has been what's happened on social media platforms. And I'm not talking here about, you know, the many issues around automation or tax, all of those. I'm talking simply about trust and confidence in the way in which information reaches us and the choices we make. There are arguments that go beyond even what you're talking about. They are about responding to the internet as a technology in the way in which countries like the US or like ours in the UK responded to broadcasting as a technology, or back in the day, the printing press. We did over time develop systems where the owners of those technologies had responsibilities and they were legally liable when they abused them. Do you think that there's a need now to do something similar at that scale, whether it's interventions like breakup of those companies or whether it's about liability for the outcomes on their platforms?
Last I checked, the argument for a breakup hasn't been made out. The demonstration that breaking up Facebook or Twitter or YouTube would be a net benefit hasn't been established. But the idea of liability for, let's say, defamation on the platform, that's not the worst idea. And to hold the company liable for things that have been found to be defamatory, that's perfectly reasonable. And maybe to say as well that if something is clearly defamatory, even though it hasn't been adjudicated to be defamatory, so it sounds a little like hair splitting, but the latter imposes a greater burden on the social media platform. I think that's very thinkable too, which is a long way of saying I'm completely with you that to think of social media platforms as a little more like publishers.
Yes.
We have today, that's a very reasonable direction.
I mean, I have to say, Cass, I thought that the Twitter moment last week, or maybe it was the week before, where they acknowledged that the president's tweets were misleading, was a colossal moment, because in that moment they said, look, we take responsibility for the accuracy of what's published on our platform. And although I know his tweets and the ones they criticized were about the mail-in ballots, at the same time he was making tweets that certainly within UK law would have been eligible for a defamation suit as regards Joe Scarborough, the talk show host, and the insinuation or allegations he was making about Joe Scarborough would have stood up to at least the bringing of a defamation suit, and therefore, it seems to me, makes Twitter liable, because Twitter is the publisher of those tweets. Is there any movement in the US to actually take action against Twitter or any of the platforms on that?
There was discussion, but let's take 2 points. First is what Twitter did there was a nudge. It was not it didn't take it down. So the kind of minimal thought is we need much more of that from the platforms. The second point is to say that Twitter should be liable for what is clearly defamatory is a very thinkable thought, at least if it's unambiguous. At the same time, to treat a social media platform as the same as a newspaper or magazine is probably not a good idea. Right. Just the massive volume of material there means that it would on balance be really destructive to say they have to pay $1 zillion or euros or pounds in damages in a case in which they let something up. Now, maybe if they're notified and if the demonstration is sufficiently compelling, they have to take it down. That would be, that's also very thinkable.
Okay. I'm very encouraged by this. I must say, I'm really encouraged because it does feel as though things are moving. But I'm actually getting in the way of poor Joe Whitaker, who's had that small blue digital hand up for ages. Joe, sorry for keeping you.
No problem at all. So, Cass, you've obviously been writing specifically about group polarization for a really long time now. And obviously we're in really, really polarized political times. So this kind of, I guess, in some ways follows on from what you've just been talking about. But what do you think behavioural sciences kind of can offer us as potential solutions moving forward to perhaps try and alleviate some of the polarization we're in?
Okay, so for those of you for whom the word group polarization isn't like the word sport or football, meaning it's not incredibly familiar, it means that like-minded people engage in conversation with each other typically end up in a more extreme point in line with their tendencies before they started to talk. So if you get a group of people talking about climate change and they're concerned about it and think it's going to get really hot soon, a lot of people are going to die, they're going to get really stirred up as a result of talking with each other. You probably saw this with Brexit, where like-minded people talking with each other got more extreme and more condemning of the other side. Okay, there's a lot we can do. So as individuals, we can watch our information diet. And if it turns out that we're reading people basically think as we do, that's a little red warning flag in our own minds that we should branch out a bit. And for social media providers, thinking of Facebook now and its design of newsfeed, it should be very attuned to this problem. And there was a recent story that purported to show, and might be right, that Facebook was at one point very concerned about group polarization and alert to the possibility of redoing its newsfeed in various ways to try to ensure they're not contributing to it. And somehow that got stymied. It should be unstymied. So Facebook et al. Should be focusing on exactly what you describe and not contributing to social division.
Within that context, Cass, can we go back, if you like, to the COVID crisis then? And in the last few minutes that we've got, think a little bit about this next stage, because the restarting of the economy, the restarting of schools, the next phase for social care, all of these things are going to require changes in behavior. And I'm struck by the number of people who I think are reassured by your account of the positive outcomes for nudges, but I think, like me, probably would love concrete examples of where they're working and where we might use them in our own society or working lives.
Well, New Zealand, which admittedly has an easier situation than some countries, has signaled 2 points. One is unity, and the other is be kind. And that both of those things are smart. So the notion of unity picks up on the social norm idea and their power. And just using that word in a context where it's credible can make it a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's what's happened in New Zealand. The words be kind as a slogan, they have a good effect in giving people a focus on the fact that if they don't wear a mask or if they don't do what's suggested or required, they're putting other people at risk. And data suggests that people are more likely in the context of COVID to act in a precautionary way if they are not being killers of others. They don't want to do that than if they are saving themselves. That's important, that people do want to save themselves, but they're more likely to do the relevant thing if that's what they need to do, so as not to endanger others. Now that's uplifting, I think, about our species. It might not be true of every person in every country, but it seems to be a regularity. And New Zealand's built directly on that with the notion of be kind. So as we open up a bit, to have small signals like this, will at the margin help? And are you going to prevent 10,000 deaths that way? That would be a nice surprise. If you prevent 50 deaths, 100 deaths in a relatively large place, that's a big achievement.
And then how does that feed, Cass, into the politics of the United States this year? Because You know, I was always taught that, you know, people can talk about inspiring ideas in policy, but when it comes down to election years, you know, negative advertising works, as we've seen. A divisive, you know, picking up on Job's point, a polarizing politics has seemed to work. You know, do you think that unity and be kind, those kinds of messages, are going to be effective in this election year?
Well, they won't be effective if you're saying to, let's say, supporters of one of the other candidates, be really kind in the election to the person whom you want to lose.
Right.
That's not going to work. And kindness probably isn't the perfect message for Trump or Biden to have in the context of an election. But if there's a school that's opening up, or a community where stores are starting, or sports events are starting, et cetera, to have some, you know, and I'm not going to say that kind is the right word for every place, but to have some notion of considerateness or civic responsibility in a way that meets people where they are, rather than being some top-down imposition by someone who thinks he or she knows what's most moral, to have something that is developed in the community, in the context, that's an outgrowth of the cultural norms, that's working. So where I live right now, which is in Concord in Massachusetts, people are wearing masks and they're staying home. And it's not because they're thinking, I'm going to be arrested if I don't wear a mask. So they're thinking that's the wrong thing to do. And as we, you know, open up a bit, there are multiple things that each of us can do, either through our behavior or through our conversation. Nothing sanctimonious about it, respectful of difference. And the fact that, you know, a lot of people where I live are not in accord with me politically, that doesn't matter even a little bit. I want those people not to get sick, and I hope they feel the same about my family.
And do you think it's a really interesting point to end on, which is essentially the good instincts of people, the reasonableness of people. Do you think that there is a fundamental misreading, both in politics and in the press, of the way in which people, the public, behaves, that we tend to see in ourselves, in our society, a level of anger, conflict, and actually underestimate the extent to which people are constructive and collaborate? And if there is a failure along those lines, whose job is it to help recognize that?
Okay, so should we talk about another little science? I don't know if you like dogs, or how many of those who are online like dogs. Raise your hand if you like dogs. Okay, so what we now know is dogs self-domesticated. That is, dogs have a relationship to wolves that comes out of their self-domesticating. They came close to people. They were the tamest. They were the most docile. They were the, pardon the word, friendliest. And they had babies with each other. And then there are Labrador retrievers, and the world of dogs is as it is. Recent research, this in the last few years, suggests that human beings self-domesticated too. That is, we bear exactly the same relationship to Homo erectus and Neanderthals and other extinct human species as dogs bear to wolves, and as bonobos bear to chimpanzees. That is, we are more trusting, more cooperative, more able to read each other's emotional and other signals. And you know why we survived? That's why.
Well, that is, okay, well, that is at a time when there's so much reason to be, frankly, furious and despairing and sad, that is a wonderful way to think about ourselves. I'm going to give the last point, or the last question, if I might, to Harvey Jackson, because I think the question while you were talking, Cass, that he was putting, which I thought was a great one, was actually about how do you take that nudge science. Hello, Harvey. That nudge science. Well, why don't you put it to Cass, because it's a great place to end.
Hi, yeah. So my question was basically, how do you propose that behavioural economics can be used to nudge government officials to take a more long-term approach for their policies?
Okay, great. So I'm going to give you an answer that's not going to make you smile, I'm afraid, but it's cost-benefit analysis. So when I was in the US government, and this is true under most Republican as well as Democratic administrations, you have to calculate costs and benefits, and that includes completely consideration of future generations. Now there's a discount rate. If it's high, they'll be considered less than if it's low. But if you do stuff that involves climate or involves the ozone layer, and you think about costs and benefits, then future generations are staring at you.
Okay, well, Cass, actually, that is, you've ended us there both on an optimistic note and an invigorating one. I want to say thank you. We try to keep to time, at least this, in the ending of this. I wanted to say a couple of things. Firstly, I wanted to say a huge thank you to my colleague, Liz Mosley. You know, when you're in trouble, you want colleagues who say, yeah, great, I'd love to do a ThinkIn with 250 people and Cass Sunstein in 12 minutes. Yeah, so thank you, Liz. Secondly, I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined, because just following the conversation in the chat and the extent to which we really are trying to think about how we can engage in ways that change our behavior. You know, we touched on some of these things around information, climate to begin with, and obviously around COVID-19 and race. But a really deep thank you to you, Cass. And I think there's one word that I'm going to take away from this, which is perhaps a new one for my vocabulary, but much more empowering than I'd ever expected, and it's thinkable. It's the idea that you can bring new ideas into the marketplace of how our society is and our countries work that are thinkable, and that then deserve, you know, an effort to kick the tires on them, to examine their pros and cons, and then possibly act on them. And for us, you know, the ThinkIns themselves are an exercise in trying to find ideas that are thinkable. And what you've done tonight for us has really opened our eyes and our minds to what are ideas that are thinkable. So a huge thank you to you, and a huge thank you to everyone. Had you been in our newsroom in London, we would have taken you out to the pub to, you know, celebrate you and thank you. There would have been no point because the pubs are all closed. So even at this distance, we give you a huge and hearty thank you. All we can do is wave you off with our gratitude. Thank you very much indeed.
That's all.
Thank you.